Hey guys, this is Gary, and in this video I want to talk to you about how to set your exposure manually. Now, this can be daunting because you're dealing with three parameters. You're dealing with your shutter speed, you're dealing with your aperture as expressed in f-stop numbers, which are kind of bizarre numbers and a little hard to wrap your brain around, admittedly, and you're dealing with ISO. So that's known as the exposure triangle. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO. 3 points on the triangle. I have a much better idea. Figure out what kind of picture you want to take first. That's going to determine at least one of those parameters, so you don't have to think about it. All right, so before we do that, how do you actually set these three? On Canon cameras, you have the shutter button, of course. Right behind the shutter button is the shutter wheel. Now, when you dial in M on your mode wheel, and that's true for any camera, when you dial in M, you've set your camera into manual exposure. So when you turn your shutter wheel, you're adjusting your shutter speed. On the 5D Mark II and several other models of Canon cameras, we have a wheel back here. This wheel changes your f-stop number or aperture. Now, on some Canon cameras on the back, there's a button labeled AV. If you push the AV button with your thumb and turn the shutter wheel with your forefinger, you're now adjusting your f-stop numbers. If you take your thumb off the AV button and just turn the shutter wheel, once again, you're changing the shutter speed. On Nikon cameras, there's usually the main controller. It's a wheel on the upper right-hand corner on the back of the camera body. That will control your shutter speed. Now, right behind and to the right of the shutter button on Nikon cameras, there's a little button with a little icon for an aperture. It's like a little circle with another little circle in the middle. That represents the aperture. If you push and hold that button with your forefinger and take your thumb and turn your main controller, not your multi-selector, your main controller wheel up in the upper right-hand corner, if you push that button right behind the shutter wheel and hold it and then turn the main controller wheel with your thumb, you're now changing your aperture. If you let go of that button on top of the camera body and just turn your main controller wheel, you're changing your shutter speed. Some Nikon cameras have a wheel in front, known as the sub-controller, and a wheel in back, known as the main controller. In manual, that wheel in front will change your aperture setting, and the wheel in back changes your shutter. Okay, ISO. On Canon cameras, there's always, somewhere on the camera body, there's usually an ISO button. When you push that button, you activate the ISO adjustment and you use your shutter wheel to change it. Now, on a lot of Canon cameras, the ISO button is in the back. Same deal. Push the button, you can change the ISO with the shutter wheel. On Nikon cameras, it's a little more confusing. I'm not a Nikon shooter, but I have noticed that there are actually two places that you need to adjust your ISO. If you have auto ISO engaged, you have to go to a different menu item than the menu item in which you change your ISO values. So with auto ISO engaged, if you change your ISO values, they're completely overridden by the auto ISO setting. So you have to go into a different menu item, find auto ISO sensitivity, I think it's called, and turn that off. Then you can access your ISO adjustments. Now, if you hit the info button on a Nikon camera, you get to your ISO. On most, if not all, Nikon cameras, you have a function button behind your lens barrel on the camera body in this area. You can go into your menu and assign that custom function button to anything you want. I recommend changing it to change your ISO values. All right, so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how you change these values. So going back to my initial proposition, which is that rather than try and understand how these things work, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO together, figure out the kind of picture you want to take. All right, so rather than try and explain it, let's go outside and we're going to put this way of thinking, as it were, in practice so I can help walk you through the process. Okay guys, now we have 3 pinwheels here. I'm going to be shooting that way. I'm going to be using a long focal length of 200 millimeters, and I'm doing that for a couple reasons. Number one, I want to get a lot of compression in this scene. You can't see it, but About 20 feet back, there's this big bush, although from this distance, it looks really small. Thanks to the compression that a 200 millimeter lens gives me, it's going to pull that bush in really close and make a nice background for these things. The other thing is, as you can see, the wind is moving them. I'm going to do a shot that is stop action first. So that would mean a fast shutter speed. So this is what I'm talking about. I want to get a stop action shot. That means I want to go to like 1/500th of a second. That's rule of thumb. That's usually where stop action starts. So at 1/500th of a second, that's preset. So now all I have to really worry about are my f-stop setting and my ISO setting. Depth of field, f-stop, aperture. Right now it's at f22, and I just know from experience that's going to be way too small. So I'm going to open it up to about f8, and I'm going to step back here and frame up my shot and see what my exposure looks like by reading the meter. That's the thing. If you just read your meter, you don't have to do any math. Okay, so basically I'm going to step back here, frame up my shot at 200 millimeters. I got to step back further. I'm trying to get all 3 pinwheels in the shot, left to right on my frame. I'm focusing on the middle pinwheel, and at 200 millimeters, the bush is creating a nice background. So I am at 1/500th of a second, f8, ISO 50. I don't have enough light, so I'm going to raise up my ISO. I'm going to raise it up to 400. That gets me about, well, okay, that gets me at exactly 0 on my meter, but I know that I want to underexpose it. So I'm going to go down to 200 on my ISO, f8 aperture, and I'm going to take the shot, and the pinwheels are moving really fast, so here we go. Okay, so, all right, not bad. I got this nice background. The background is actually pretty soft, even in f8. And the front pinwheel, because I focused on the middle pinwheel, the front pinwheel is soft. So if I wanted to get all 3 inside of the depth of field so they're all sharp, I can try going down to, say, I can stop down to f16, all right? And then I can also, because I've done that, and I want to stay at 1 stop under, I'm going to have to raise my ISO up to 800. That gets me about 1 stop under. Actually, it gets me more like 2 stops under, so I'm going to go to 1600. What the hell? Okay, so that's a little bright, but whatever. So I'm going to try and see what this looks like at f16. Okay. And, all right, the front pinwheel is still soft, but not as soft. I'm going to change my focusing point to right in between the middle pinwheel and the front pinwheel. But, oh man, this is hard. All right, let's try this. I've altered my focusing distance. All right, so that's f16. I don't like that because now the background is getting too sharp. So I'm going to go all the way to f4. That's going to really open up my aperture, which is going to give me a much shallower depth of field. Along with 200 millimeter focal length, it's going to be very shallow. So at f4, 1600 is way too high. So I'm going to go down to ISO 100. And leave my shutter alone. Haven't touched my shutter. Actually, I'm going to go to ISO 50. Haven't touched my shutter. Okay? All right, going to take this shot. And yes, a much softer background. You can't even make out the front pinwheel. I'll focus on the front pinwheel, take another shot. And now you can barely make out the middle and the third pinwheel. Okay, so the point is, as I change my aperture, I have to also alter my ISO. I'm leaving my shutter alone. Now, I'm going to go in the other direction. I'm going to get some motion blur. So I'm going to slow down my shutter to roughly like 1/60th of a second. If the wind picks these things up, that'll give me some motion blur. So having slowed down my shutter, I've changed my exposure. So at 1/60th, I have to stop down my aperture to about f9. That gives me, well, let's say f11. Yeah, that gives me about it's too dark. Let's go with 1/50th of a second shutter, 1/40th of a second. All right, so 1/40th of a second is actually way too slow handheld with a 200mm focal length, but this is a stabilized lens. If I'm really careful, I might be able to pull this off. So I'm waiting for the pinwheels to start turning, and of course now that I'm ready, there's no wind. By the way, it's like super hot out here. I'm sweating like a pig. The pig sweat? Oh, here we go. This should give me stop action. I'm sorry, not stop action, motion blur, and it does. And I'm gonna go back up to 1/500th, do one more thing to sort of really illustrate. Now, I'm at ISO 50, f11, shutter speed of 1/40th of a second. I went back up to 1/500th, f11, ISO 50. Now, there's no way I can take a picture right now. It's way too dark. So I'm gonna open up my f-stop to f5.6. I'll raise up my ISO to, I'm guessing 200. Good guess. All right, 200 works. I'll take a picture. Stop action. Okay, and I'm looking at the back. Now, I have actually kind of a cool depth of field. It's shallow, but not super, super shallow. That's actually pretty cool. I'll do one more shot where I focus on the front pinwheel, take that. Okay, all right, so basically, here's the deal. Instead of trying to figure out exposure and trying to think in terms of, what shutter speed, aperture, and ISO is going to give me the right exposure, the first thing you do is think about the character of the shot you want. Like if I want stop action, I know I need a fast shutter. Might as well just preset that. I'm not thinking about exposure at this point. I'm just thinking, I want a fast shutter speed to stop the action. All right, so then it was a question of what aperture and or ISO combination do I need? And in the case of a fast shutter, 1/500th of a second, I had to raise my ISO up a little bit because I decided on a medium aperture setting. Like I can't even remember now. I think it was f11. If you just think about the shot you want to get and then worry about the characteristics of that shot more than you're thinking about the math, if you read your meter, it's actually pretty easy. Your meter's going to tell you. You're under, you're over. I tend to shoot in this kind of light, one stop under, because things are so bright anyway. And that's it, really. It's not any more complicated than that. I hope that makes sense. I would suggest you just try it yourself. Preset one of those parameters. Shutter, aperture. Really, it's shutter and aperture, because those are the creative those are the creative parameters. Figure out which one of those is going to give you the shot you need, and then adjust the other two based on your meter. And don't worry about the math. It's actually pretty easy. Just go out and shoot manually, because the more you do it, the easier it's going to get. All right, see you guys next time.